Okay, so we are starting a new book from the Forgotten Classics, from the series, okay, it's the World History series, and book 9, Stories of Mexico, South America. And the first book is Cortez and Montezuma by Mara Pratt. Chapter 1, Cortez and Montezuma. When Columbus reached this continent of ours, he little knew how great a land was before him, nor would he have then believed, had he been told, that in this new continent were people whose cities were hundreds of years old, and whose manners and customs were not so very different from those of the people of the old world he had just left. I often wonder what he would have said if he could have seen the ruins of the mound builders, or had visited the beautiful golden cities of the Aztecs. His own surprise, I'm sure, would have been equal to that of the Spanish people themselves when Columbus returned from his long voyage and told them of the new shore across the great water. Far inland from where Columbus landed was a wonderful city called by its people Mexico. The king over these people, the Aztecs, was Montezuma. In reading of this king in history, you will hear strangely contradictory stories of him.
He was called Mexico? Probably mean
Mexico.
Mexico.
Yeah, Mexico is how we pronounce it, but in Mexico they pronounce it Mexico.
Mexico. That's interesting.
In reading of this king in history, you will hear strangely contradictory stories of him. One historian will speak of him as the gentle-hearted monarch, giving you the impression that he was a veritable Philip Sidney in the midst of a barbarous community. Another will speak of him as a coward, a traitor, a deserter of his people in time of trouble, and, withal, a stern and unyielding tyrant. Surely he could not have been both of these. And so, in reading of him, it will be well not to agree quite with either side, but try, in our judgments of him, to remember his surroundings, the traditions that governed him, and to bear in mind the manner of people over whom he ruled, their demands and their needs. Montezuma had been educated for the priesthood, though among the Aztecs a training for the priesthood was more a training for war than for peace. As a youth, Montezuma had little hope of becoming king, for, although his father had been king, it was the custom in this country for the office to go to the king's brother, if there was one, rather than to the son. When Montezuma's uncles had both died, the 4 nobles who were elected to choose the next king met in solemn council. As Montezuma had been a successful warrior, had performed most acceptably his duties as priest, and was, moreover, unusually respectful and modest in behavior, the choice fell upon him. It is said that when the news of his election was brought him, he was most dutifully engaged in sweeping down the steps of the temple. I wonder if the Aztecs believed their Montezuma would always conduct himself as humbly in the office of king as he had in the office of priest. I don't know that they would have liked him to, or that they would have even approved of it had he done so. Please stop.
He's poking me.
Stop, Isis. Judging from the reverence the half-civilized races show to their priests and kings, I should hardly think it would have been at all agreeable to these Aztecs. One thing, however, is sure, and that is that Montezuma, as ruler, gave them little opportunity to see whether they would have liked that manner of king or not. No sooner had he taken the oath of his office than he assumed also a manner of bearing and of living that, in their grandeur and formality, could hardly have been more lofty in the most cultured courts of Europe. He allowed no one but nobles to serve him, and of these some 600 waited daily upon him. He allowed no one to enter his presence without first removing his shoes. All who presented themselves before him bowed very low and said, "Lord." Another bow, and "My Lord." Another, and "Great Lord." All this must be said in a low, reverential tone and with bowed head. Montezuma held...
Can I eat this?
Yes. There's others there that are that are not like that, right? While you're there, can you get this for me? Can you hear me from in there? Yeah? All right. Montezuma held himself as far too sacred to be gazed upon by the common people of his household. He always dined alone, and had drawn around him a golden screen that even his noble attendants might not gaze too curiously upon him as he ate. His dishes, too, of the finest material that his people could make, were never used a second time. I hardly think you would have felt really at ease had you been invited to dine with this august emperor. The ways of the people were curious enough, and the ways of the royalty were more curious still. When Montezuma announced himself as inclined to dine, a throng of young nobles appeared, bearing each some dainty dish with which to tempt their master's appetite. These were set upon the matted floor, and the young nobles at once retired to an antechamber, in which their dinner was to be served. A beautiful Mexic woman then brought water with which his majesty's hands were washed, another arranged his robes, and others stood waiting to perform the least of Montezuma's commands. He himself cast his glance over the many dishes set before him, and pointed with a golden rod to the dish that seemed most to catch his fancy. All the other dishes were then carried to the nobles in the adjoining room. Montezuma's attendants then stood waiting, all with eyes turned away lest they should appear to see his Royal Highness in the process of eating. After dinner, Montezuma smoked and took a fine long nap, after which he was ready to meet his people. While he is taking his nap after this very stiff and unsocial dinner, let us look about his palace. It was a very large building of stone, with large, long rooms, sheathed with cedar and other sweet-smelling woods. In the courts about the palace are beautiful lawns with splashing fountains, gardens of rare and beautiful plants, tanks of fish, and great aviaries in which sang the beautiful, gay-colored tropical birds. All these palace gardens, and all the city, in fact, were kept in finest order. Nothing so incensed Montezuma, it is said, as slovenliness. Woe unto the serving man whose work was not well done. The streets of the city were, by his order, kept in such a condition of neatness that one could walk them without even soiling his feet. Montezuma was also very liberal towards his people. The poor of his own city and in the immediate neighborhood were generously cared for by their king, and the king in return was loved and reverenced by his subjects. Contentment and prosperity seemed to prevail throughout the kingdom, and in comparison with other Indian peoples, Montezumas were certainly in an advanced and comfortable condition. But in the midst of, so maybe we can replace when they say Indian peoples, since this is a very old book, when they still used to call them Indians, we'll call them indigenous, okay? Indigenous people, meaning the people that are indigenous to that region, okay? But in the midst of all this came rumors of a strange new people, white men, who had landed on Mexican shores and were marching inward to attack the Mexican cities. At the same time, strange omens began to appear. The lake suddenly, and without any known cause, rose, overflowed its banks, and destroyed a large part of the city. Then the great temple blazed up in a sudden light. Strange shooting fires appeared in the skies, and awful rumblings were heard beneath the earth. Montezuma, very superstitious, and so restless with fear, sought the advice of a neighboring king who had marvelous powers of prophecy. "These strange omens," said he, "are but the forerunners of your city's downfall." Montezuma, knowing that the white men were advancing on his city, and believing implicitly in the prophecies of the reader of the stars, was filled now with a mysterious dread, a shadowy fear, a sad foreboding of what was to happen. Hour after hour he would sit in his favorite retreat among the cypress trees, pondering upon the fate he knew must fall upon his much-loved city. So, helplessly and hopelessly, he awaited the coming of his foe. Never a thought had he that meantime he could make any preparations to protect his people from these white men, or in any way circumvent their plan of march and attack. The gods had prophesied ruin to his people, and he had been educated to believe that nothing could change the decrees of the gods. To have thought of such a thing, much more to have tried in any way to resist a fate so decreed, would have been a sacrilege, an act so atrocious, so irreverent, that nothing less than a thunderbolt would have been speedy enough punishment for the wicked mortal who had dared disregard the warning of the gods. So Montezuma sat in silence and in fear, dreading the coming disasters which were to overthrow his power, subjugate his people, and ruin his beautiful and prosperous country. Remember all this by and by, as you read how feebly Montezuma resisted the white man when at last he really came. You will know that it was not cowardice, but rather religious belief in the omniscience of his gods that controlled Montezuma in the hour of trial and peril to his kingdom. End of chapter 1.